So, first up, Ben, could you tell us a little bit about your background and route to your current role?
Okay, well, I studied history at university, which was one of the best things I ever did. And because I think it's about the point there is that writing history, and particularly the further back you go, means taking an imperfect set of information and then trying to first of all understand what's going on, and then build a narrative from it, and maybe even learn from it, which is actually very similar to what we do in market and social research, where again we don't have all the information. We haven't spoken to everybody on the planet. And even if we did, they wouldn't always tell us everything that was on their mind. And so again, in our, there's a lot of parallels. But anyway, I joined this company after university, not knowing what to do. I joined the graduate training scheme in 1987, and I have failed to leave. I thought I'd only stay 2 or 3 years, but anyway, I failed to leave. We did a leverage buyout. We borrowed money to buy the company from its original owner in the year 2000. My company was called Mori, and we sold it to this company that I'm now the global chief executive of in 2005. I was leading our work for government for a decade until about 2009, and then I was in charge in the UK and Ireland for about 12 years, and then in about 2021 I became the global chief executive, and I now live between London and Paris and other places. Yeah.
What a journey, and a few more years than 2 in the end.
Yeah.
And tell our listeners, what is Ipsos and why is market research important?
Well, I think market research is one of the things that helps create the modern world, and it's since the Second World War, just before the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, for young people on the call who don't do history. Market research is the first time in history, really, that human beings have been able to understand properly what everybody else is thinking, and on a pretty regular basis. And this is long before social media. And so that means that you're able to make sure that markets are more effective. We can produce things that are more likely to be used and less waste, produce better public policies, or understand why people won't do things that appear to be rational. And how you can in ever more complex societies which we live in, how societies can be led, or what societies are thinking. And more diverse societies, people aren't the same. We aren't just living in small villages or small towns. And so I think market research is a way of actually ordinary people. It's also a tool for democracy, because before market research, you had to rely on people like Donald Trump or Simon Jenkins, a journalist, to tell you what everybody else was thinking. So politicians would tell you what people were thinking, or journalists would. But now you have research. They can't. Well, they can try and spin it, but ultimately you can. You now know what everybody's thinking, and that helps you make better decisions. So, my friend Tim Harford, who writes for the Financial Times, describes it. He wrote a book called The 50 Things That Made the Modern World. And he's got, electricity, the internet, internal combustion engine, etc. But he's actually satellites, etc. But he's also got, interestingly, market research, which I think is a reminder about just how important it is. And without it, and it's interesting when you see by-elections where there's no surveys that are published, you suddenly find out, and people will be spinning all sorts of lines in the media, and half the time they turn out to be complete garbage. So market research is not perfect. It's like democracy. It's not perfect, but it's better than most of the alternatives, having some kind of survey data.
Indeed. And just to bring it to life for our learners, many of whom are sort of 16 to 18, yes. Could you talk about one or two of the most important bits of Ipsos's work? Well,
sure. Some of your colleagues, some of your learners may be thinking about going to university. So one thing that we do every year is a study of all the university students in Britain, and we ask them about their experience at university. So you can go online and find out what the social life is like, what the teaching is like, what the support is like, what the help getting a job is like at these different for every single university in Britain. And that's one thing we do. do. But I mean, it is extremely diverse what we do. So obviously a lot of our work is for people like Google. We just published, they're our biggest client. We just published a survey on how willing people are to try out AI and what their concerns are about AI. But we're also working in Gaza at the moment, where there's a conflict between Hamas and Israel, and we're doing that for the World Bank, and we're studying the level of damage to buildings in Gaza using mobile phone signals and satellite data. And finally, for some people, what would be interesting, we changed the law in Scotland a year or so ago by doing mock rape trials to look at the effects of changing the law to remove the not proven option in Scottish trials, which is different than in English trials, to see if that led to a higher conviction rate. And as a result, the law in Scotland got changed. So it's just very diverse. Anything about what human beings are doing, looking at. We provide the official data on internet traffic in the United Kingdom. So how many people look at each website? That is a data provided by Ipsos from a panel of 10,000 homes, where we look at all of the devices in the home and what people are doing on those devices, for example. So I could go on, but it's just anything human beings do or think, we measure.
And related to that, and you've already covered one of these, but can you give us an example or two where your insights have led to consequential actions?
Well, I mean, the most striking was during the COVID pandemic, where we were tracking by random sampling of people's homes. We were tracking the spread of the disease, because the issue with COVID-19 is that some people get very ill and a very few people die, but a lot of people have it and don't even realize that they have it, but they can infect others. So what we were doing during the pandemic for the government is every week we were randomly going to approach individuals in their homes using NHS records and asking them to give us a saliva sample, or in some cases even a blood sample, and we were therefore able to predict waves of the disease and provide advice to Downing Street. We can argue about whether or not Downing Street and Boris Johnson took that advice on when it would be sensible to lock down. This was obviously before the development of the vaccine, and so, to be quite honest, the wave that hit in the autumn and winter of 2021, we could see that coming in August 2021. You can see it in the data. So that's and again, why are we doing that? We're a market research company, but what we have is I think this is a key point for problem solvers like your learners, is we have the ability, of course, to persuade people to do things voluntarily, which is something we have to do every day to persuade people to take part in surveys. And we are used to randomly sampling the population, because again, that's the normal thing that we do every day anyway. So even though we're not experts in handling COVID samples, we had to build a cold chain, which means refrigerated vans. We had to put fridges into 5,000 courier vans to keep the samples at the right temperature, to get them to a laboratory. And there wasn't any laboratory in Britain at the time that was capable of handling this volume of samples. So we had to fly them on a chilled aircraft from Stansted every night to a laboratory near Munich. And we built that in 10 days without any sleep, of course. But just to show you, so there's a real world example of how sampling and surveys lead to tracking a disease. And I think hopefully, we believe, by locking down at the right time, saving people's lives. I mean, you can argue about whether you should lock down at all, but anyway, we think it has real world impacts. I mean, there are so many examples of those. Yes, the reason when you go into Britain and it says UK border as you go into immigration, that was a recommendation from one of my surveys about 15 years ago, just to show people that this is the border and people are being stopped, etc., to remind them that so there's all these lots and lots of things like that.
So many interactions every day that we have with Ipsos inspired bits.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd like to focus on two topics, both of which have already come out in this sort of introductory section. And the first one I'd like us to drill down on as a problem area is how technology can help us on Ipsos understand what people are thinking and doing. So, my first question on that is, can you tell us a little bit about the role of software and data in how Ipsos conducts market research currently? Because it's not just surveys.
No, I mean, I think so obviously the bulk of our work is online, is people agreeing to take online surveys in return for Amazon or other vouchers. But you still need to use software to collect this data on, and it needs to be as frictionless as possible for the respondent. It needs to be quick to process. It's funny, we've just added a piece of software to our data stack, or tower. I'm not a technologist, and it's reduced the processing time on some of our most complex surveys from 15 hours to 10 minutes. So that's an example of how software can improve things. Obviously, another part of our business is just looking at digital behavior. So you're taking petabytes and petabytes of data in real time from thousands of devices, and looking for the signal in the noise. Which is, again, turns out to be quite a complicated, I think with many of these things, it's easy to describe. And when you practically come to do it, it turns out to be a bit more difficult. And I'm always, as the audience is 16 to 19, I'm afraid I'm going to use a slightly inappropriate metaphor. But, as Google put it, big data is like having sex when you're a teenager. It is often eagerly anticipated, but there is often disappointment when first attempted. And that's that. Some of our problems are that I can easily describe tracking thousands and thousands of devices and merging the data and looking for everybody who went to the Sunday Times or Sky website, and then checking that the person going to it on X rather than on Facebook is actually the same person or not through our panel. But we can describe that. When you practically come to do it, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated. So I have, dozens of people who are just cleaning data. I mean, and I think generally one of the interesting issues in my work, we just bought a company of around 100 people, I think, called Germany, just outside London. And one of their biggest clients, interestingly, is Microsoft. So you might think, well, why is Microsoft using this company? And all they do is take data that companies already have and analyze it and process it in a way to help the companies make better decisions. But interestingly, what they tell me is that a very large part of their work is just getting the data into a format where it can be analyzed. And we have that same problem when we now come to the latest thing in our armory of tools, which of course is generative AI, where we're building our own large language models. We're loading decades of transcripts of focus groups, of people talking into the computer. We've got 15 billion bits of social media data that we've already built a large language model to interrogate. It's going very well. It won an award from Procter & Gamble last year. And of course, we're loading up decades of banks of numbers, but it's getting it into a format that the AI isn't intelligent. It's just very good at pattern recognition and probabilistic reasoning. So it shouldn't really be called intelligent as I would understand it. Anyway, I don't believe it is. But getting it into the format where it can be used it takes time, interestingly. So AI helps us do that. It saves processing time, I suppose, is what, particularly if you're handling large amounts of text. Obviously, AI is, the large language models based around text are very useful at doing that. Numbers are proving a bit more challenging at the moment, and so we'll see, and fuzzy logic, etc. And one of the troubles is still hallucinations. That's a real that is a real issue. So but yeah, essentially my industry has moved from interviewing people with bits of paper and a pen to telephone interviewing, which we still do a lot of telephone interviewing, and AI, of course, we can start to use to just analyze voice. So rather than saying, are you very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very satisfied, you could just say, well, tell me about what it's like when you go to visit your local GP, and how is it, and you can actually, and of course we can now use the AI to actually invent the questions. So rather than having very boring questions, please tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how important it is that the GP surgery is clean, you can literally just have a conversation where you probe, and the computer probes as a human being. What else else is important when you're in there? And you didn't mention how friendly the receptionist is. Does that matter? Oh, yes, I love Mary. She's always friendly. Oh, okay, all right, that's interesting. So you could, and actually the generative AI could make interviews much more interesting, rather than at the moment. One of the problems with market research is that a lot of the questions our clients want to ask, and a lot of the historical conventions in market research, are incredibly boring. On a scale to 1 of 10, tell me how important each of these 7 things are to you when you're making a choice about which pen to buy, and you're like, you what? I mean, get out of here, So we need to. So we're looking at, can we just make every interview a really interesting interview? And we could find out that if we know that young men are more likely to respond to, I don't know, attractive looking young women or young whatever, we could create different personas for different sorts of people. I mean, we do that in real life. If we send somebody to your house and you refuse to be interviewed, we might send back somebody of a different gender or age to see if that was more convincing. We already do that sort of thing, but now we can immediately say, right, well, this guy is a man, he's about 35, that's the sort of person he's likely to find engaging, would be this sort of person. But if you were Chinese, then you might want to be interviewed by somebody who was Chinese, or rather than Western. So again, it depends. Nigerians don't like being interviewed by people from the Caribbean. Caribbean people don't like being interviewed by people from Nigeria. So again, we could adapt the personas that we use. So we're trying all of these things, but it's I think the challenge is it's, as I say, it's much easier to describe many of these things than to make them work at scale. And one of the things I would say to people listening is, and it's been a challenge when we've bought software companies, of which we have a great many, is that making something that works most of the time, or can work with a little bit of adaptation, isn't very good for me. I mean, I've got a small business that we bought about 5 or 6 years ago, and they're sort of 30 people, and they will build you something lovely. It's a bit like my hi-fi that I have at home. I have a very expensive record player made by a man in a garage in Kent. And when it goes wrong, he comes around, and it goes wrong quite often. So when it works, it's beautiful, but it's made of concrete. It's balanced on glass balls. It's got, I don't know, some sort of filament, carbon fiber arm and all this sort of thing. But the trouble is, I have to keep having this man from Kent coming around to fix it. And so if you're a small business using a software company and you're working with them, and they'll sort of change the software every 10 minutes to help you with your problems, or you identify a problem. When you're dealing with a 1 billion company, which is what our data collection part of Ipsos is, around 1 billion, it has to be perfect. It can't sort of work sometimes and not other times. It has to be 100% perfect in all known situations. Now, and that of course means me specifying very, very precisely what I want, which again, I don't always know exactly. And so that's been quite an issue for us with small software companies, that they're very exciting. They've got a great idea. But I mean, there's one I bought in America, and I was talking to the guy yesterday. He's got something that sort of works, but it doesn't work all the time, and that's just not good. Unfortunately, in this type of, our clients don't, Google or Meta or somebody. Oh well, Ben, it didn't work. Well, I'm sorry about that. It works most of the time. It doesn't really. That's not really good enough,
That makes sense. So would it be fair to say one problem that our learners might focus on is the future of the survey, or the future of the interview, and what Gen AI?
There's a lot of work being, obviously there's a lot of companies working on this at all the time, but yes, why not? That would be something to have a look at. I mean, one there are various hypotheses that have already been explored, but they may wish to explore. So one is that we don't need to ask people questions anymore, because we can just look at everything they post on social media. If you can get access to Facebook, because some of these things are walled gardens. So we have a whole load of interesting arrangements with software companies, but perhaps you don't need to ask them all these questions, because you can sort of find out all these things about people. So that's one hypothesis. The other is that we don't need to ask structured questions anymore, because we can build bots and large language models and avatars to ask people questions, and so we can cut out the interviewer entirely and just have an unstructured discussion with somebody using an avatar that will probe. And we've been obviously working on this for some time. Not sure how much progress we've made, but maybe your guys will do better to do that. I think that's another hypothesis. Another is that you can just take all the data that we already have, where we've asked people hundreds of questions, and we can construct synthetic individuals from that. So there is already something where the attempt is to create 66 million bots that behave like the UK population, so that when you show them an advert, you can tell how the real people would react. But of course, you don't have to pay people any money to either interview these people or pay real people money for taking part, because the bots are going to predict what everybody would do. So these are all things that are going on at the moment. I mean, there's also a lot of work being done over the last 20 years on reading facial expressions. So again, when I ask you a question, one thing that we do is look sometimes at how quickly you answer. So it was interesting during the Brexit referendum. One thing that we could see is that if you ask people, Brexit voters, do you think it's going to be good for Britain's sovereignty to vote to leave the European Union? They all press yes immediately. And then if you ask them, do you think it's going to be good would it improve the British economy? The answers there took rather longer. So they still said yes. So if you were just looking at the raw answers, it was always 100% yes, the economy will grow and prosper outside the shackles of the European Union. But interestingly, of course, it took them about 5 milliseconds longer to answer that. So that was a sign. So there we were picking up a subconscious signal that perhaps they weren't as certain about that aspect of Brexit as they were about the sovereignty aspect. So we've done work trying to measure people's perspiration, heart rates, even ECGs. There are experiments to make you wear a little hat to watch your brain waves while we show you things. And so you might say that I thought that advert was disgusting. But actually we'll find that what the brain waves are showing, you're actually really interested and excited by it. So the social norm was to show that you weren't going to say that you liked this terribly sexist advert, but actually you quite liked it. Subconsciously you liked it. And similarly, so there's a lot of work that's been done in all of these areas to try all of these technologies, even putting people into MRI scanners and getting them to do surveys. So this idea that you don't, again, we will do things where we will at the moment show you adverts that have never been shown on TV and ask you to just watch them, and then we'll ask you to sort of maybe move your cursor to show how much you like it. But we would also be looking for micro signals in your facial expression, speed of response, and so there's all of these things are already being tried. So I think one thing I would say actually to people who are working on a problem is do your desk research. Maybe use your Gen AI, it may or may not be able to tell you the answer. But there's already been a lot of work that's been done. There are endless startups trying to make me go bankrupt by there's regularly people for the last 20 years in this business. I've been told I'm going to be made to go bankrupt by somebody who's got some amazing new technology that's going to mean that I am now redundant. And in fact, I myself, 24 years ago, wrote a paper in the year 2000 where we said that we wouldn't be doing any data collection in the year 2020. There would be no need to do any data collection at all, because there would be so much data around about what everybody thinks about everything. All we would do would just be to look at the data, and then we would be consultants just looking at that data that was already available and advising our clients what to do. And instead there are more surveys than ever. So I was obviously completely wrong.
So, and as I said at the beginning, the core purpose of this problem and the challenge is as a learning exercise and to engage you in a very, very important and interesting set of problems. So it is not to displace Ipsos.
I'm very, if one of these people comes up with a brilliant idea, I can make them rich, that's fine. But it is a it's a challenge. And I think the other thing I would say in passing is also remember, my job is to understand what the world is thinking. 1 in 3 people on the planet have never been on the internet. And so if you think that you can sit in your bedroom in Sheffield, London, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Devon, Cornwall, Humberside, wherever, and understand what's going on in Nigeria, good luck. Good luck. And that's one reason why I still, and even in the UK, because the people who take part in surveys, may or may not be normal. online, so that's one of the reasons why we still go around and pester people, and why the most accurate surveys in a general election are not the ones that we do by telephone in our case still, 1 or 2 days before the election, but of course are the exit poll that we do with pieces of paper and cardboard boxes outside carefully selected polling stations, which very accurately predict the results. But of course there we know these people have actually voted. Yeah.
So to round this first topic off,
yes,
I want to just drill down into one problem where our learners may have an inbuilt advantage over most of your staff.
Yeah.
The fact they are 16 to 18, and
sure.
I suspect none of your staff are 16 to 18.
Well, actually, we do have a lot of interns. They're not quite that old, but we really value people joining us while they're doing their A levels or while they're at university, because they're much better prepared for the real world when they come here. What the worst sort of people sometimes are people who went to one of the finest and most expensive universities in the UK, but aren't actually prepared to do any real work and think that they're going to be just joining on Monday, and on Tuesday will be advising the Prime Minister on what to do next. And so we much prefer people who have got some real world experience and hands-on experience at an early age. So one of my most successful people actually started at 15 in her summer holidays.
Wow. Well,
but your 16 to 19-year-olds are obviously very interesting people, and of course some of them are going to be, well, they're not quite. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the complete ubiquity of social media, because we're very interested in them, because the mental health, of course, is a major issue, and you've got this group of people who've had mobile phones and social media their entire lives, and they're only just really now coming on stream. I mean, I guess your guy, if Facebook takes off around 2008, so what's that, 16 years ago? So yes, but they were only just born when this was happening. So they would have lived their whole lives with Facebook and with smartphones, and so that's really quite interesting. I mean, we know that they're much more likely than my generation, for example, to describe themselves as not being completely straight in terms of their sexuality. That's a big generational difference. But also quite, generally in the West, but not in Asia, pessimistic about the future compared to previous generations at the same age. Which is again interesting, and of course a much more difficult, although the world felt pretty difficult when I graduated in a world of mass unemployment in 1986, and when I went to university in 1983. Of course, here the problem now is not so much unemployment as underemployment, and finding a job that pays enough to be able to get somewhere decent to live, etc. So some real challenges. And yes, I was worried about nuclear war, very worried about nuclear war in the 1980s. Some people might be very worried now about climate change, and they might be climate change might be more difficult to avoid than nuclear war, strangely. And actually, I suppose nuclear war might be having a bit of a comeback as well. So which might explain why people are a bit pessimistic. Yeah,
indeed. So I guess my question was going to be, what are the particular challenges in gaining the thoughts of young people under 18s?
Yeah.
And, which of those problems might be accessible to them to think about?
I think, it's how you engage with people. So, of course, we do a lot of work for companies like TikTok, which is a site, a place which is pretty popular with young people. I think to be honest, it's always been a problem getting young people to take part, because it's the busiest time of your life in terms of self-actualization, and you're discovering yourself, your sexuality. You change more between the age of 15 and 25 than you probably ever do in the rest of your life. And so they're very busy discovering themselves, discovering relationships, working out what they're going to do with their lives, than which is slightly different than, say, 65-year-olds who've sort of done most of their life, and they have other issues. So you've got to be where they are, and you've also got to make things relevant and interesting. And one of the hypotheses is that people become more interested in things, some political issues, when they settle down, get a house, have a stable relationship, and have kids. And of course, there's more and more people who may never have children, because one of the other big very clear demographic things is that in the West, fewer and fewer people are having children. Well, actually all over the world. And actually the world population will peak sometime in the middle of this century, and then it will start falling, which is probably a good thing. If we believe that the number of people means that we're using more resources than the world can comfortably sustain. So the world population will get back to a number at some point, but it does mean our societies will go through very interesting periods where, there are, as in Japan at the moment, there are many more people buying nappies for elderly people than for babies, because there are, relatively, there are just far more old. This is a transition our societies will need to go through to get to a more stable point in terms of how we use resources, and how whether humanity can be around in 1,000 or 2,000 years time.
Yeah. That's super useful.
So I think, but getting access to getting young people who want to take part in things, who are not, and making something that's simple and easy and engaging without being patronizing, because, yes, you can talk about, one of the things in my industry is gamification, turn everything into a game, but actually that's also a bit patronizing. I think there's lots of young people who are perfectly interested in really serious real world problems, but it's framing it in the right way and finding them, they're less likely to be sitting at home waiting to answer the door, and they're probably less likely to, they're pretty social media savvy. So, if I send them an email, they're probably, well, what's that, etc. But maybe I can get something to pop up in TikTok, which is again something that we do. But that's a challenge.
Brilliant. Let's move on to core topic 2 of 2. Turning insights you get from your data into action, because of course collecting the data isn't enough to change behavior. So what does it take to translate data into insight and insight into action within Ipsos?
Well, it's complicated, because it's not enough. First of all, we have to take the data and then say what are the implications of that information for you and for the business problem or public policy problem that you're facing. Having made those recommendations, though, you then run into a whole load of new problems. So you say, right, you aren't communicating enough with your key stakeholders, so you decide to send them all a postcard or something, and but then you put something stupid on the postcard. So I'm using a very simple example, but I think that the challenge comes in an organization not only being able to receive recommendations, but then being able to actually have the structure and organization, and also organizational will, to act on them. So a lot of the time we all suffer from biases, however important or otherwise we are. And so sometimes you'll make a set of recommendations, and the company, even if they sort of might believe it, I've got a very good example of this, which is one of the biggest telecoms and hardware manufacturers in the world. And I went to see them, and they're all about, making a better device. I can't say too much about who they are, but they're going to make the best device, and they're obsessed about their lenses and their screens and the speed of the chips. And I'm sort of saying, look, the trouble is when you actually when you actually study people using your devices, of course, or using the type of device that you're competing in, actually all of those technical things that you're so proud of and absolutely may be better than the competition. Unfortunately, the way the public and the users are judging these devices is not about, yes, they want a good camera lens, but it's actually about operability and how engaging the operating system is. And so, you're back to for some people on the phone, many people on this listening to this may or may not know about the VHS versus Betamax story. So this is two forms of videotape, which was a quaint old 20th century technology where we coded onto electromagnetic tape signals that were read by a reader, and that's how we used to watch films before digital streaming. And anyway, VHS was a lower grade, was more grainy, so the pictures weren't as good, but in that format you could fit twice as much onto a tape as on Betamax, which cost more, had a better picture, but also used more tape to show a given amount of programming or content. And so Betamax people were, this is a much better picture, everybody's going to buy the better picture, but they didn't, because they didn't understand that good enough won. And this is the sort of, so this can be a situation where, so Sony says, oh, I've got Betamax, it's way better. Everybody else goes with VHS, and Panasonic wins or whatever. And so this is often an issue, that you've got a culture inside a client organization that doesn't want to change in the way, well, it's very true in government as well, for God's sake. I mean, which about yourself, James. They're not prepared to act. In medicine, it's very interesting. Clinicians, if you're trying to talk about improving hospitals, clinicians are only interested in, does the person get better or not? They don't really care about how unpleasant or otherwise the process of actually getting that treatment is in the first place, or or how difficult it was, or anything else. They just like, does my operation work? And trying to teach them that you're going to get much better outcomes, even if it's easier to follow your instructions and etc. You've thought about how you're communicating, and you've made people happier. They're more likely to come in and report the next thing that they suffer from if they found it a pleasant experience. Is hard, because of course the professional ethics are all around just curing people, the clinical effectiveness, rather than just treating people well while they're doing it. In my world, my challenge with my people is often that they are trained to get the number to be as accurate as possible, and they're not trained enough, and this is something I have to work on constantly, on how to persuade the client to use that information to make a decision. And there's actually a tension in their training, because their training is you need to be objective. The number is the number, and it's not your role to change the number or even interpret the number. If that's what it is, that's what it is. Even if people say something that seems completely crazy, like 40% of the French population are Muslims, which is what the French roughly believe, which is, of course, is not true. But it's you need, and so we have to work with people, having trained them to get the number to be right. In other words, how many French people, how many Muslims do French people believe are in France? Then you have to say, well, why do they think that? And that might, you may have to do another survey, or you may have to have hypotheses about why that is. And then if you want to reassure people about how many Muslims there are in France, do you just tell them it's actually only 15% of the population, or whatever it is? Or do you, and the problem is, even telling them it's 15% might alarm some people. So there's a very delicate balance to be struck. One of the things I've seen happen in the past is on drugs. Working with police, London, the Metropolitan Police, they knew that drug dealing was a concern in London, so they decided to put up huge billboards all over London saying, we're cracking down on drugs, the Met, making London safer. And all it did was just make most people who've never experienced drug dealing more worried about drug dealing. So it's had precisely the opposite effect. So, how you react, helping our clients react to the information, because it's not always, sometimes the best thing to do is to say nothing, rather than try and do something about a problem. And these are all things that you learn with experience as I suppose, an experienced researcher or somebody used to dealing with a particular problem. But it's not the software won't tell you what to do. Yeah, that's the challenge. I guess one of the things we're working on is, and this is back to Blink, which is a book by Malcolm Gladwell. And he says, well, look, when you look at this photo here, you will immediately know whether this is a photo by a famous, if you show this to a famous expert on photography, there's a very famous photographer called Slim Aarons, who in the late 20th century took photos of the rich and glorious people having a lovely time in Saint-Tropez, etc. And you can see all these photos. Now, how do you know if it's a real Slim Aarons or not, or a real Rubens or not, or a real Van Gogh or not? And the answer is that an expert will look at that, and there'll be a lot of little things they'll immediately look for. And it's the same with me. When I look at a set of survey data, I will be immediately looking for a number of things, like, are the young black people more pissed off than the old white people? Well, normally that's what happens. So if they're not, that's really interesting. But there are hundreds of those things. If I look at a survey, I originally used to spend a lot of time looking at how happy people were with their local councils. So I know that, people should be most unhappy with road maintenance and potholes, and probably more likely to be happy with things like library services. So if you suddenly go somewhere where they're not, and it's the other, that's really interesting. But it's not the absolute number that matters. It's because with roads, 30% being satisfied is like a really good score. With libraries, 70% being satisfied is a really bad score. So this is this point about context. And so Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink talks about how experts use a set of signals. He says that, you know, if you want to tell which doctors are going to be sued in America, you just have to watch the first 1 minute of their consultation with a patient. And you in that 1 minute, you will have spotted the thing that is going to lead to that doctor being sued. For me, in my industry, there are a number of things that an expert can look at now, and maybe we can bake into the algorithms to immediately spot. So are the young black people the most miserable? Oh, that's what they, and you start to look for that. But we're a long way from doing that at the moment. We're starting to.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing I want to just dig into there, Ipsos, obviously pretty damn good at doing surveys, done very, 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 very many over many decades.
Yeah.
You know, lots of people do surveys not through Ipsos, probably more people individually. Are there tools already? Has anyone had a crack at this problem of up-leveling the surveys that people and organizations do individually without professional help?
Sure. I mean, and I think there are, if you go, there are various platforms that you can go to where you can use a pre-selected set of questions. So you will start typing in the sort of question you want to ask, and it will actually suggest a better way of asking the question. So those things already exist. We use them internally. We're building an AI. So when you start typing, "Are you satisfied?" you'll immediately get a drop-down menu of different ways of asking how satisfied you are with something that have already been done and used. You just click on this one and use this one. So that already exists.
Okay, brilliant. Might be something to have a little look at and see whether people have done it particularly well or not. Since it's not since it's implemented in Google Forms or Microsoft Forms, my feeling is it's probably not solved yet.
But I mean, it was interesting actually. Google are my biggest client, and they used to have a business called Google Surveys, and they closed it down. Which is interesting, because we were worried they were going to just make us bankrupt, because we are a little bit like the fish that goes around with the shark cleaning its teeth, you know. But actually the shark at any time might decide just to eat the fish. But you know, you see it's a little brown and white fish that you see. If you see a great white and a nature movie, it'll be going through the ocean, and there'll be this little fish eating the bits of dead meat off. It cleans his teeth, so they've got a relationship where he cleans his teeth. And the shark goes around his business. Well, I'm a little bit, Google and our relationship's a little bit like that. But it was interesting that they don't want to do what we do, because ultimately they're an advertising business and a software business, and we're a market research business. So they could go into market research, but it doesn't pay very well, you see, unlike Google advertising, so online advertising. So they don't, and they rely instead on us, which is an interesting thing about, you know, comparative specialization, and, you know, having, you know, being good in a niche can work.
I'm conscious of time. Can I ask you one more question, then we'll just cover a Gene point. You know, this is hopefully a fairly short and sweet one. You know, when our learners, they will build various things. Some will be useful to you, some may not. But when they're thinking about feasibility and viability considerations, can you give them a few pointers? I think we've already had one. You know, it needs to be scalable and accurate, because you're in the research business. But are there any other they should think about when they build?
It needs to be replicable, and it obviously needs to be. The other challenge is that you often find so many people email me every day with their new software, these startups, and they're all doing something that already exists. So, or they're doing something a bit differently to something that already exists. And it's just, you know, the challenge for big companies also, and this is the challenge, is, and I'm not sure what the simple answer is to this. Buying small software companies, you know, is very tricky, because they've got limited bandwidth. So unless they've got there's a thing I'm just buying that's, you know, 4 people in London have built. They've been doing it for 10 years. And it's a great solution. I'm going to make them, they'll all be able to pay off their mortgages and they won't be rich, but they'll be comfortable. And because I can take that and immediately apply that to a large number of things around the world, and it works, you know. But they've been at it for 10 years. If it's just somebody, well, I've got this idea and I think I can do this. It's just, to be honest, the transaction cost for us, the time needed to go and look at that, unless it's really amazing, is we're just not going to have time to look at it. That's the problem for big companies. But we are. well, we're a, I don't know, 19,000 people company. We're not tiny. We're not the biggest company in the world by any stretch of the imagination. But it's so that becomes the challenge. It has to be very, very specific about the problem it's trying to solve. I think if it's just I've got a great way of, you know, coding people's answers or reading social media. I bought a company called Synthesio that does that, you know, 5 years ago. So, you know, that's the thing. That was my point that I was trying to make about you really need to do your research about what already exists. It may not be easy to find, and you might need to get it. That's the challenge with this sector. It's not, you know, although we employ more people than the fishing industry in Britain, you know, there are very bespoke solutions that are already being created, and so, you know, I will know about them because that's, you know, that's my job. But they're not things like Microsoft, you know, or TikTok or something. You know, they're not generally available. So that is sort of the challenge, you know, not just reinventing the wheel.
Okay, that's super useful.
Yeah.
Hey, Ben, fascinating
Pleasure.
interview. Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
that.